close your eyes and picture this. The year is 1770, and you are standing in the narrow streets of Boston. The smell of salt drifts in from the harbor, mixing with the acrid smoke of tallow candles and the sour tang of ale seeping from the taverns. Somewhere nearby, a printing press slams shut with a heavy thud, spitting out another sheet of inked paper, pamphlets, arguments, grievances, each one feeding the fire of unrest. The cobblestones beneath your boots are slick with winter rain. Red-coated soldiers stand at corners, their muskets gleaming, their eyes sharp and watchful. The tension between them and the townsfolk is like a drawn bowstring, too tight, too ready to snap. You hear the low rumble of voices inside a tavern just ahead. Doors swing open, spilling warmth, laughter, and rage into the night air. Tankards slam onto wooden tables, arguments flare, and above it all, a cry rises. No taxation without representation! But the world around you is not so simple. Many here still toast the king's health. Families are divided, brother against brother, father against son. For every rebel whispering of liberty, there is another hand clutching loyalty to the crown. And beyond these streets, in the plantations of the South, enslaved men and women look on with hollow eyes as men speak of freedom. To them, liberty is a promise wrapped in chains. This is the American Revolution, not a tale of neat heroism, but of chaos, betrayal, and impossible choices. It is a war fought not only with muskets and cannons, but with words, with rumors, with ink on cheap paper and whispers carried in the dark. Imagine yourself here, at the threshold of history, the fire not yet lit but the air already thick with smoke. You can hear the future straining against the present, like a storm pressing against shutters. The revolution has not yet begun, but you can feel it, inevitable, dangerous, unstoppable. The tavern door shuts behind you, muting the clamor of voices to a muffled roar. Outside, the rain has softened into a fine mist, and lantern light glimmers faintly against the damp stones. You walk slowly, careful not to slip, and as you do the city itself begins to speak. Not with words, but with the rhythm of its life, the uneven clip of hooves, the slosh of a cartwheel in the muck, the whistle of a sailor stumbling out of an alley, and somewhere above it all, the echo of church bells tolling the hour. Boston, 1770. A city perched on the knife's edge. But to understand why, we must step back, not just into this street, but into the slow burn of discontent that brought us here. Because revolutions are never sudden. They are sparks falling on dry tinder, each one landing with a hiss, until one day, at last, the fire catches. Imagine yourself in London, a few years earlier. The 7 Years' War has just ended in 1763, a conflict that stretched across continents, known to Americans as the French and Indian War. Britain emerged victorious, but at a cost so staggering it nearly bankrupted the crown. Soldiers had to be paid, ships built, debts settled. And from the polished tables of Whitehall to the smoke-choked coffee houses of the city, one question pressed against every ledger and every whispered conversation: who will pay? The answer seemed obvious to Britain's ministers. The colonies, 13 of them sprawling along the Atlantic seaboard, had gained the most from the war. French Canada had fallen. Native allies of France were weakened. The frontiers were safer. Shouldn't the colonists pay a fair share for their own defense? But what seemed obvious in London felt like insult in America. You see, colonists had already paid, in blood, in coin, in fields torn by battles. They had sent militias into the forests, housed soldiers in their homes, lost sons on muddy battlefields. And they had grown used, in those years of war, to handling their own affairs with little interference from across the ocean. Now, suddenly, Parliament wanted to tighten the leash. The first sparks came quietly, with laws written on parchment. The Sugar Act of 1764. The Stamp Act of 1765. Dry names for explosive policies. Picture yourself as a Boston printer, ink on your hands, debts on your back. Suddenly, Parliament declares that every legal document, every newspaper, every playing card must carry a special stamp purchased from British officials. It is not just a tax. It is a declaration that your livelihood depends on the distant will of men who have never walked your streets. Or imagine yourself as a Virginia lawyer, proud of your education, proud of your eloquence. You draft deeds, wills, petitions for your neighbors. And now, every sheet of paper you sign carries a cost imposed by men you did not elect. Patrick Henry, standing in the House of Burgesses, will thunder. Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III made profit by their example. The words nearly get him accused of treason. But the meaning is clear. The cry rises. No taxation without representation. It sounds neat, almost like a slogan fit for banners and broadsides. But in truth, it is not about the pennies and pounds. It is about dignity. About power. Who decides what is fair? Who governs? Parliament insists the colonies are virtually represented, that the empire is one great family and its interests are shared. But the colonists laugh bitterly at the phrase. Representation, to them, means the right to send their own voices across the sea, not to be spoken for by strangers who know nothing of their lives. The protests swell. Effigies of tax collectors are hung from trees, doused in tar and set aflame. Crowds gather, their shadows dancing in the firelight, shouting curses at the king's officers. In Boston, the Liberty Tree becomes a sacred site, its branches heavy with symbols of defiance. But not everyone cheers. Many merchants, tied to British trade, mutter that resistance will ruin them. Loyalists, though not yet called by that name, warn that rebellion is folly, that the might of Britain is too great to challenge. And in parlors from New York to Charleston, families argue bitterly over dinner tables. Some raise toasts to liberty, others raise toasts to the king. The Revolution, even in its earliest moments, is not a war of Americans against Britain. It is a war of Americans against each other. The Stamp Act riots terrify London. Parliament repeals the tax in 1766, but not without a slap, the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies. In all cases whatsoever. It is like extinguishing a fire while leaving a trail of embers. The colonists celebrate repeal with bonfires and feasts, yet the words, "in all cases whatsoever," linger in the smoke, ominous, unforgettable. Soon more sparks fall. The Townshend Acts of 1767 tax glass, paint, lead, tea, everyday goods, reaching into every home. Customs officials tighten their grip on ports. Smugglers are dragged before vice-admiralty courts with no juries, no neighbors to weigh their guilt. Soldiers begin to arrive, red coats bright against colonial mud, muskets glinting in the sun. Their presence is meant to keep order. Instead, it feels like occupation. Imagine standing in a Boston street in 1768, when the first regiments march in. The drums beat steady, echoing off brick walls. Children gape, dogs bark, and mothers clutch their children closer. The soldiers' boots strike in unison, iron nails on stone, a rhythm as cold as empire itself. Shops close their shutters. From the windows above, men and women glare down, whispering to each other, "Are we conquered? Or are we still free?" The city changes. Soldiers quarter in homes, in taverns, in warehouses. Their presence sparks fights in taverns, quarrels in alleys. Sometimes it is just insults, a shove, a drunken scuffle. Sometimes it is worse. The fire is building. You can smell it in the air, the mingling of resentment and fear, of pride and desperation. Pamphlets pour from the presses, sermons disguised as essays, essays disguised as sermons. Samuel Adams, John Dickinson, a chorus of colonial voices. Meetings crowd the churches, resolutions pass, petitions are sent across the Atlantic. The king barely glances at them. The spark becomes a flame. In March of 1770 it bursts into violence. You stand on King Street, now known as State Street, on a cold night. Snow crunches underfoot, frost bites at your fingers. A mob gathers, hurling insults at a small group of soldiers. Lobster backs! They shout. Bloody backs! Snowballs fly, then sticks, then stones. Muskets are raised. Someone yells fire. Was it an order or a taunt? A shot cracks through the night. Then another. Smoke curls into the freezing air. When it clears, 5 colonists lie bleeding in the snow. Crispus Attucks, a black sailor, is among the dead. The Boston Massacre, they will call it. The name itself is propaganda, crafted to inflame. Paul Revere engraves the scene, showing disciplined soldiers firing into helpless civilians. It spreads across the colonies like wildfire, printed, reprinted, whispered. And in that moment, the revolution ceases to be theory. Blood has been spilled. Yet even then, peace is not lost. The soldiers are tried in court, and John Adams, future Patriot leader, defends them. He insists that justice must not be sacrificed to passion. Most are acquitted. For a moment, law seems to triumph over rage. For a moment, the fire dims. But only for a moment. Because taxes remain. Soldiers remain. Suspicion remains. And above all, the sense that the colonies are treated as subjects, not citizens, gnaws at every heart. Tea becomes the next battlefield. In 1773, Parliament grants the East India Company a monopoly, flooding America with cheap tea. But cheapness is not the point. It is the principle. Accept this tea, and you accept Parliament's right to bind you. So imagine yourself on Griffin's Wharf, December 16, 1773. The harbor lies dark, the ships moored silent. Men disguised as Mohawks creep aboard, hatchets in hand. The chests are split open, the tea hurled into the water. The air smells of salt and tannin, bitter and sharp. Waves lap against the hulls, carrying away the leaves of empire. The Boston Tea Party, they call it. To London, it is an outrage. To the colonies, it is defiance made flesh. And the spark that had smoldered for a decade now leaps into open flame. The waves slap gently against the wharf as the last fragments of tea leaves scatter into the harbor. The night air is cold, but it hums with energy. An act of defiance has been made, a message sent not just to London, but to every colony along the coast. Yet if you were to follow the shoreline southward, away from Boston, you would soon discover that not everyone hears the message the same way. Because the American colonies were not one people, not one voice, not one dream. There were 13 separate experiments, each with its own economy, its own culture, its own tangled loyalties. To walk through them is to cross borders as stark as those between nations. And for the revolution to live, these differences had to be woven into a single, fragile fabric. Step with me first into New England. The air is sharp with pine and salt, the soil rocky, grudging in its gifts. Here life revolves around the sea. Harbors groan with ships, and every street smells of tar, fish, and wood smoke. Boston, Newport, Portsmouth, ports alive with merchants, sailors, and smugglers who know how to evade the king's customs men with a wink and a hidden cask of molasses. In Massachusetts, the town meeting is king. Farmers and artisans gather in clapboard meeting houses, their boots muddy, their tempers quick. They argue, vote, shout, and storm out, only to return the next week. Democracy is not yet a formal word here, but it is a living practice. This is the soil from which Samuel Adams and John Hancock rise, men skilled at stirring both crowds and pamphlets. But go a little north, to the rocky coasts of Maine, or west into the forests of New Hampshire, and you'll find lives less touched by politics. Lumberjacks, hunters, small farmers, they care less about representation and more about survival. To them, the debates in Boston feel distant, almost foreign. Already, we see the revolution's problem. How do you ignite the same fire in a frontier homestead as in a teeming seaport? Now drift southward, into Connecticut and Rhode Island. The rivers churn with mills, and the valleys hum with small farms. In Rhode Island, trade rules everything, including a thriving and shameful trade in human beings. Newport ships sail to Africa, exchanging rum for captives, then carry their human cargo to the Caribbean, bringing back molasses to make more rum. Liberty here is shouted loud, but it rests uneasily beside the chains in the hold. Connecticut, meanwhile, is stern, shaped by Puritan roots. Ministers thunder from pulpits, warning that tyranny is not just political but spiritual. To defy Parliament is to stand for God's order. Congregations leave the meeting house with the sense that rebellion is not merely permitted, it is holy. Cross now into New York. The city of New York itself feels unlike anywhere in New England. Walk down Broad Street and you'll hear Dutch, English, French, German, even African languages mingling in the marketplace. Merchants here are cautious. Many trade directly with Britain and grow rich from it. Why risk war that could destroy their fortunes? The Hudson River Valley is ruled by vast estates, patroons whose tenants live in near-feudal dependence. The farmers grumble about their landlords more than they do about Parliament. Yet even in New York, sparks of rebellion smolder. The Sons of Liberty hang effigies in the streets. Pamphlets circulate from tavern to tavern. Still, the city is divided, a place where loyalists are loud and strong, and where neighbor eyes neighbor with suspicion. Further west, into the wilds beyond the settled valleys, another world emerges. The frontier. Cabins of rough-hewn logs, fields hacked from forests, rifles hanging above doors. These settlers live face to face with native tribes, trading, fighting, sometimes intermarrying. For them, the revolution is tangled with questions of land. Britain's proclamation of 1763, forbidding settlement west of the Appalachians, feels like betrayal. Why spill blood against France only to be told they cannot claim the land? For the frontiersmen, liberty is not about parliamentary charters but about space to breathe, land to seize, and the right to defend it with their own muskets. Now we turn to Pennsylvania. Here the story shifts again. Philadelphia is the largest city in the colonies, its streets laid in neat grids, its wharves crowded with ships. It is a city of Quakers, who preach peace, and of printers like Benjamin Franklin, who pens essays with which sharp as any sword. Walk through a Philadelphia market, and you will see Germans selling sausages, Scots-Irish farmers with rough accents, Quaker merchants in plain gray coats, and African slaves carrying burdens. It is a world of astonishing diversity, buzzing, quarrelsome, alive. Pennsylvania's Quakers, with their pacifist principles, will struggle with the coming war. Some will remain neutral, others will side quietly with Britain, unwilling to condone bloodshed. Yet Philadelphia will also host the Continental Congress, the heart of American defiance. In the same city, you will find men ready to pledge their lives to liberty, and men who refuse to fight at all. Move further south, and the air thickens, heavy with heat and the smell of tobacco. Welcome to Virginia. The plantations stretch wide, fields worked by enslaved Africans whose songs rise over the rows. Here, wealth is measured in acres and in people owned. The gentry, the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Lees, speak of liberty with eloquence drawn from Cicero and Locke, yet their wealth depends on human bondage. The paradox of the Revolution is sharpest here. Men drafting declarations of freedom while others labor in chains at their doorstep. Virginia is proud, aristocratic, convinced of its destiny. Its House of Burgesses bristles at Parliament's interference. Planters grumble that British taxes bite into their profits, that restrictions on westward expansion rob them of future fortunes. Patrick Henry cries out, "Give me liberty or give me death!" Words that echo from church pulpits to tavern benches. Yet at the same time, enslaved men and women whisper their own prayers, that liberty might one day mean liberty for them. Southward still, into the Carolinas. North Carolina is rough, scattered, a land of small farmers suspicious of elites, many of them recent immigrants with long memories of oppression back in Europe. They are fierce, independent, and prone to rebellion against their own colonial governors. The regulator movement, farmers rising against corrupt officials in the 1760s, foreshadows the revolution itself. Here, resistance is less about fine speeches and more about raw fury against anyone who would lord over them. South Carolina, by contrast, is wealthy, polished, and brutal. Charleston's streets echo with the clatter of carriages and the cries of enslaved laborers hauling rice and indigo. Its elite live in grand houses, dine on imported wines, and read newspapers hot from London. But the entire system rests on the backs of enslaved Africans, who outnumber whites in the Low Country. The planters fear Britain's taxes, but they fear slave uprisings more. When the revolution comes, their choices will be shaped by both, resisting British control while tightening the chains at home. And finally, the southernmost colony, Georgia. Youngest of the 13, founded only in 1732, Georgia is still half wilderness. It was meant as a buffer against Spanish Florida, a haven for debtors and the poor, but by the 1770s it too has plantations rising, fields tilled by slaves. Georgia is cautious, slow to join the fire of rebellion. Its people feel exposed, vulnerable to both Spain and native tribes. They will wait until the very last to cast their lot with the revolution. 13 colonies. 13 worlds. From rocky New England to steamy Georgia, from Quaker meeting houses to Virginia mansions, from frontier cabins to bustling ports. Each carries its own grievances, its own fears, its own visions of liberty. To weld them into one cause is like trying to bind iron, fire, and water into a single blade. And yet, out of this cacophony, something begins to form. Letters dart from colony to colony, carried by riders along muddy roads. Committees of correspondence stitch together outrage into unity. Pamphlets echo from Boston to Charleston. The words of one colony become the watchwords of another. A sense grows, not of sameness, but of shared peril. Imagine standing at a crossroads tavern in 1774. A Virginia planter, a Pennsylvania merchant, a New England sailor, all strangers, all suspicious at first, share a jug of ale and discover they curse the same taxes, fear the same soldiers, dream of the same elusive liberty. The accents differ, the clothes differ, the visions differ. But something stirs. A fragile we. The 13 colonies, 13 worlds, are beginning, slowly, painfully, to see themselves not as fragments, but as one. And as the fire spreads, that fragile unity will be tested in ways no one can yet imagine. The tavern door closes behind the strangers at the crossroads, their talk of liberty still echoing in the smoky rafters. You step back into the night, and the road forks. One path leads toward rebellion, toward declarations and muskets. But the other? That path belongs to the Loyalists, the Americans who chose the king. It is tempting, looking back, to imagine the revolution as simple, patriots on one side, tyrants on the other. But it was never so clean. For every man who toasted liberty forever, there was another who raised his glass to God save the king. They were neighbors, family, sometimes even brothers under the same roof. And when the war came, it was not just Britain against America. It was America against itself. Imagine standing in a parlor in New York City in 1774. The room is lit by a single candle, the smell of beeswax mingling with the faint must of damp wood. A merchant sits at a small desk, quills scratching across parchment. He writes to his brother in Boston, pleading for reason. "You are reckless," he writes. "Trade is the lifeblood of our city. Without Britain we are nothing. Do you think France will treat us better? Do you think we can stand alone against the Empire? You call it liberty, I call it ruin." To him, loyalty is not cowardice, but prudence. Britain's navy rules the seas, its armies stretch across the globe. To rebels seems madness, a leap into the abyss. And he is not alone. Historians estimate that between 1/5 and 1/3 of the population remained loyal to the crown. That is not a fringe, that is a multitude. They lived in every colony, though stronger in some than others. New York and the South teemed with loyalists. New England was harsher ground. Why did they cling to Britain? The reasons were as varied as the colonies themselves. Some were merchants and professionals who prospered under imperial trade. Their fortunes were tied to London banks and British markets. To cut those ties would be to sever their own wealth. Others were officials, judges, customs men, Anglican ministers, whose authority flowed from the crown. To them, rebellion was not just treason but career suicide. Still others were recent immigrants, Highland Scots who had fought for Britain barely a generation earlier, or Germans who had been granted land by the king's agents. To betray that gift seemed unthinkable. And many were simply cautious souls, skeptical of mobs and revolutions. They had seen riots in Boston, tar and feathers on the streets, effigies burning in the night. To them, patriot liberty looked dangerously like anarchy. Better the known hand of Britain than the chaos of the crowd. Step with me now into a loyalist household in Pennsylvania. The family gathers by the hearth as news of the Boston Tea Party spreads southward. The father shakes his head. Lawless destruction, he mutters. What will London think of us now? The mother worries aloud about her brother in Boston, already marked as a rebel sympathizer. Their eldest son, restless, argues back. Father, it was a statement. We must show them we will not be slaves. The room grows hot with words, hotter than the fire and the grate. This is not a debate across oceans, it is one across dinner tables, across bedrooms, across marriages. But loyalism was not always a choice born of wealth or caution. For enslaved Africans, loyalty to Britain could mean a chance, just a chance, at freedom. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation offering emancipation to slaves who fled rebel masters and joined the British Army. Imagine the shock in plantation households as whispers spread through the quarters. Freedom, if you could reach the king's lines. Thousands would risk everything to do so. For them, loyalty was not to George III, but to survival. Native tribes too saw Britain as the lesser of two threats. They watched as colonial settlers pressed ever westward, hungrier for land each year. Britain's proclamation of 1763 had at least promised limits, lines across mountains meant to protect native lands. The colonists cursed those lines. The tribes clung to them. To many nations, the Mohawk, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the British crown seemed the last frail shield against the endless tide of American settlers. And then there were those bound by faith. Anglican ministers, loyal to the Church of England, prayed publicly for the king. In New England villages where rebellion ran hot, such prayers were dangerous. Congregations walked out. Ministers were jeered, harassed, sometimes driven from their pulpits. In some towns, loyalist churches were boarded up, their bells silenced. To stay loyal was to risk not just your position, but your life. The revolution, for loyalists, became a slow unraveling. First came social scorn, neighbors whispering, shops boycotting, friends avoiding your eye in the street. Then came open threats. Patriots forced suspected loyalists to sign oaths of allegiance to the rebel cause. Refusal could mean tarring and feathering, property confiscated, homes burned. Picture the scene. A crowd gathers outside a loyalist house, torches in hand. They shout insults, hurl stones through the windows. The man inside clutches his children, heart hammering, as his wife sobs quietly. He has lived here for 20 years, paid his dues, shared in the harvest festivals, lent tools to neighbors. Now, overnight, he is an enemy in his own village. Exile became the fate of many. Some fled to New York City, which remained under British control for most of the war. Others sailed north to Nova Scotia or Quebec, carving new lives from rocky soil and cold seas. Entire families abandoned farms, leaving behind fields, livestock, memories. Their land was seized, sold, parceled out to patriots. In the space of months, a man could go from respected citizen to wandering refugee. Those who stayed faced even harsher trials. In the Carolinas, where loyalists were numerous, the revolution became a civil war in truth. Neighbors formed militias, one side for the crown, the other for independence. Skirmishes erupted in backwoods clearings, in cornfields, in swamps. Houses were raided, crops burned, prisoners executed without trial. The war here was not distant, it was intimate, vicious, personal. Imagine yourself as a loyalist militiaman in the Carolina backcountry. You fight not in grand battles but in ambushes, sudden bursts of musket fire, then the quick retreat into forest. The enemy is not some faceless redcoat or rebel officer. It is the man who lives downriver, whose children played with yours last summer. You see his face across the smoke of battle, and you both fire, because the revolution has made you enemies. And yet, despite their numbers and their passion, the loyalists rarely wrote their own story. The victors would paint them as cowards, as traitors to liberty. Their voices were drowned by the thunder of patriot rhetoric. But listen closely, and you can still hear them. "We did not betray America," one loyalist exile would write. "America betrayed us. We sought peace. We sought order. We sought to keep the bonds of empire that had given us prosperity. And for this, we were cast out." As the revolution dragged on, loyalist hopes flickered, then faded. British promises of protection proved hollow. Farms burned, debts went unpaid. Promises of freedom for enslaved men and women were unevenly kept. By 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, thousands of loyalists boarded ships to Canada, to the Caribbean, to England itself. They carried with them bitterness, grief, and a sense of betrayal, not only by the rebels, but by Britain too. But many remained. Quietly, painfully, they rebuilt their lives in the new United States. They kept their memories close, their loyalty unspoken. Some reconciled, swore new allegiance, and raised children who would call themselves Americans. The Loyalists remind us that the Revolution was never simply a war for freedom. It was also a war of choices, each one heavy, each one costly. To rebel was dangerous. To remain loyal was dangerous. Whatever path you chose, you risked your home, your safety, your very life. So as we walk through the Revolution, never forget the shadows it cast. The patriots fought for liberty, but beside them, against them, sometimes within the same family, walked the Loyalists, the other Americans. The campfire crackles low, embers glowing red against the black of the night. Around it sit men who speak of liberty, of throwing off tyranny, of securing rights that are unalienable. Their voices rise, their eyes shine with conviction. And just beyond the circle of light, in the shadows, stand others who do not speak. They carry the muskets, fetch the water, cook the food. They are enslaved men, bound to the very patriots who declare that all men are created equal. That is the paradox of the American Revolution, a war for freedom built on bondage. Step with me first into Virginia, the beating heart of the contradiction. Here are the plantations of the Tidewater, broad fields of tobacco stretching to the horizon. Here are the great houses of the gentry, their halls lined with portraits, their parlors echoing with debates about liberty. Thomas Jefferson walks among them, quill in hand, shaping words that will ignite a continent. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. But outside his window, men and women labor under the lash. They cut tobacco, hoe rows, carry burdens until their backs break. They are not counted among the people. They are property, Jefferson's property. He will write of equality while owning more than 600 human beings in his lifetime. He will condemn slavery in one breath and defend it in another, claiming the economy, the culture, even the safety of Virginia demands it. And Jefferson is not alone. George Washington, the reluctant hero of the Revolution, rides at the head of the Continental Army, but his Mount Vernon estate is worked by the enslaved. Patrick Henry thunders, "Give me liberty, or give me death," while keeping men and women in chains on his land. The paradox is not hidden, it is woven into the very fabric of the Revolution. But not all are silent. Enslaved people themselves see the war as both danger and opportunity. When Lord Dunmore offers freedom to those who escape rebel masters and fight for the crown, word spreads like wildfire through the quarters. Imagine the whispers in the cabins at night, the glances exchanged, the hurried plans made in secret. For some, the choice is clear: risk everything for a chance at freedom. Hundreds slip away, braving patrols and bloodhounds, making their way to British lines. They join what becomes known as Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, fighting in uniforms emblazoned with the words, "Liberty to slaves." For them, Britain's cause is not tyranny, it is salvation. Others seize opportunities within the patriot ranks. Some accompany masters into the Continental Army, serving as aides, laborers, even soldiers. A few gain freedom as reward for their service. In Rhode Island, a black regiment is raised, composed largely of enslaved men offered emancipation in return for fighting. They march, they bleed, they die for a liberty that may never fully embrace them. And yet, throughout the colonies, fear gnaws at the hearts of white patriots. In the South especially, whispers of slave uprisings haunt the night. Every rumor of rebellion is met with harsh reprisals. Liberty, the masters insist, is for themselves, not for those they enslave. They speak of tyranny in London while enforcing tyranny in their fields. The paradox grows sharper still when we move northward. In New England, slavery is weaker though not absent. Here, debates begin to stir in legislatures and courts. In Massachusetts, enslaved men and women petition the courts for freedom, arguing that the rhetoric of the Revolution, the talk of rights and equality, must apply to them as well. Some win their cases. Slowly, slavery begins to erode in the northern states. By the war's end, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Vermont will have taken steps toward abolition. But even in the North, hypocrisy lingers. Merchants in Rhode Island grow rich on the slave trade. Shipyards in New England build vessels for the Middle Passage. The economy of liberty is entangled with chains. Imagine standing in Philadelphia in 1776, the city alive with the murmur of Congress. Inside the Pennsylvania State House, Jefferson and Adams and Franklin argue over words that will change the world. Outside, in the same city, enslaved men carry loads along the wharves, women sell produce in the market, children fetch water. None of them will be counted when Jefferson writes, "The people." The irony is not lost on them. In sermons, in whispered gatherings, in petitions sent to legislatures, African Americans point out the contradiction. "How can a people fight for freedom and keep us in bondage?" they ask. Some white patriots squirm uncomfortably. Others ignore the question altogether. There are individual stories that cut through the abstraction. Phyllis Wheatley, an enslaved woman in Boston, writes poetry that astonishes even the most learned patriots. In elegant verse, she praises liberty, questions slavery, and appeals to leaders to recognize the humanity of her people. George Washington himself reads her work and is impressed. Yet she remains enslaved, her voice celebrated but her freedom denied. Or consider James Armistead, an enslaved man in Virginia who volunteers as a spy for the Continental Army. He infiltrates British lines, feeding intelligence to Lafayette that proves crucial at Yorktown. His service helps secure American victory. And still, when the war ends, he must petition for his own freedom. He will finally gain it, but only after proving his worth in battle. Liberty, for him, is not a right, it is something to be earned at the risk of his life. The paradox of slavery was not merely personal. It was political. In Congress, debates about independence are shadowed by the question of slavery. Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration included a condemnation of the slave trade, accusing King George of violating human rights by sustaining it. But Southern delegates balked. To secure unity, the passage was struck out. The words that might have challenged slavery from the very beginning were silenced in the name of revolution. And so, liberty was declared, but only for some. The revolution, then, did not end slavery. It reshaped it. In the North, gradual emancipation took root. In the South, slavery hardened, became more entrenched, defended ever more fiercely as the foundation of prosperity. The very ideals of liberty that inspired the Revolution would, in time, be turned against slavery itself, but that was a battle for another century. For the men of 1776, the paradox remained unresolved. They fought for freedom while keeping others in bondage. They dreamed of equality while living off inequality. They declared the rights of man while denying those rights to women, to natives, to the enslaved. Yet the voices of the enslaved, though often ignored, never vanished. They carried forward, passed down through generations. Songs sung in the fields, stories whispered at night, hopes carried from parent to child. The Revolution gave them language, liberty, equality, natural rights, that they would seize for themselves. What was once hypocrisy became, in their hands, a promise to be claimed. So as we walk away from the halls of Philadelphia, from the battlefields of Virginia, from the plantations and the courts, remember this: the American Revolution was never just a fight for freedom. It was also a fight over its meaning. Freedom for whom? Liberty on whose terms? The answers given in 1776 were narrow, compromised, bound by chains. But the paradox left behind would echo through every generation that followed, forcing America to confront the shadows in its founding light. The dawn mist clings to the trees along the Ohio River. The water is glassy, broken only by the ripple of a canoe. In it sits a Shawnee scout, eyes sharp, scanning the banks for movement. He knows the woods are restless. Settlers push westward, clearing trees, building cabins, claiming fields. The Revolution, to him, is not about taxes or parliaments. It is about survival, the endless struggle to hold the land of his people against the hunger of strangers. For native tribes, the American Revolution was not a distant quarrel between Britain and its colonies. It was a war that reached into every forest, every village, every hunting ground. And for most nations, the question was simple: who will protect our land? Step back for a moment to 1763, the year Britain issued the Royal Proclamation, drawing a line along the Appalachian Mountains. Colonists were forbidden to settle beyond it. To London, it was a way to keep peace with the tribes after Pontiac's War, a fierce uprising that had shaken the frontier. To colonists, it was an insult, a shackle on their dreams of expansion. They had fought France for this land, they argued, and now they were told they could not have it. But to the native nations, that proclamation was a rare promise, a fragile hope that the tide of settlers might, at least for a time, be checked. When the Revolution came, the choice for many tribes was clear. Britain, whatever its faults, had drawn the line. The colonies wanted it erased. Imagine a council fire burning late into the night. The Mohawks sit with their Iroquois brothers, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, the Tuscarora. The 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, bound together by centuries of alliance, now face a terrible decision. The Revolution threatens to pull them apart. Joseph Brant, the Mohawk leader educated by missionaries yet fiercely loyal to his people, speaks with conviction. Britain is their ally, he insists. The crown has given them gifts, promised to defend their homelands. The colonists, by contrast, swarm the valleys, seize the hunting grounds, cut down the forests. If the rebels win, Brant warns, they will devour us. But not all agree. The Oneida and Tuscarora lean toward the Patriots, swayed by missionaries and local friendships. old bonds straying fracture. Brothers who once sat side by side in council now glare across the fire as rivals. The revolution will split the great Iroquois Confederacy in two. Beyond the Iroquois, the Cherokee faced the same dilemma. Along the southern frontier, settlers press into their valleys, carve farms along their rivers. The Cherokee have signed treaty after treaty, each one shrinking their land. When war breaks out, many Cherokee warriors see Britain as the only shield left. They launch raids on frontier settlements, hoping to drive the intruders back. But retaliation is swift and brutal. Patriot militias burn Cherokee villages, torch fields of corn, scatter families into the mountains. By the war's end, the Cherokee are left weakened, their towns in ashes, their lands more vulnerable than ever. Step with me into the war itself. It is 1777, the summer green along the New York frontier. The Battle of Oriskany rages, a brutal, chaotic clash where Iroquois warriors fight on both sides. Imagine standing in that thick forest, smoke stinging your eyes, the cries of war whoops mingling with the crack of muskets. Oneida warriors fight alongside Patriot militia, while Seneca and Mohawk warriors strike for the British. Brother against brother, the unity of the Six Nations shattered in blood. Further west, in Ohio country, the Shawnee, the Mingo, and the Delaware take up arms. Raids and counter-raids sweep the frontier. Settler families cower in stockades. Native villages brace for reprisals. It is not a war of lines and uniforms but of sudden strikes, torched cabins, scalped enemies. Both sides commit atrocities. Mercy is rare. For native leaders, the revolution is a gamble played with loaded dice. Britain offers alliance, weapons, promises of protection. But Britain's promises are made across an ocean, fragile, uncertain. The patriots speak of liberty, but their settlers covet every acre. To side with either is to risk everything. To stay neutral is to be devoured by both. Joseph Brant throws in his lot with the crown. Dragging canoe of the Cherokee does the same. In the Ohio Valley, Cornstalk of the Shawnee seeks peace, only to be murdered by settlers while under a flag of truce. Betrayal, as much as battle, defines this war for native peoples. And yet, even as native warriors fight, their voices are silenced in the councils that shape the future. No seat is given to them at the Continental Congress. No treaties signed during the Revolution truly honor their rights. They are allies, enemies, pawns, but never partners. Imagine the end of the war. 1783. The Treaty of Paris is signed. Britain recognizes American independence, cedes vast lands stretching to the Mississippi. Not a single native representative is present. No native voice is heard. Their land, millions of acres, is traded away as though they do not exist. For the tribes who fought with Britain, it is betrayal. The crown abandons them, pulls back its soldiers, leaves them exposed to American expansion. For those who sided with the Patriots, the reward is the same, dispossession. The revolution ends not in liberty for native peoples, but in loss upon loss. Picture a Cherokee elder standing on a ridge, watching as settlers stream into valleys once filled with his people's fields. Or a Seneca woman returning to her burned village, finding only ashes where her home once stood. Or a Shawnee warrior, staring westward, knowing the tide cannot be stopped, only resisted again and again. For native nations, the revolution was not a birth of freedom. It was the opening act of a relentless war for land that would stretch into the next century. And yet, despite the devastation, native peoples endured. They rebuilt villages, reformed alliances, adapted to new realities. They carried memory, song, and story across the generations. Their voices remind us that the revolution was not simply a clash of redcoats and rebels, but a struggle that tore through the lives of those who had lived on the land for centuries. The revolution promised liberty, but for native tribes, it unleashed dispossession. The forests they walked, the rivers they fished, the fields they planted, all became prizes in the new republic's hunger for land. And so, as we leave the warpaths of the Iroquois, the burned fields of the Cherokee, the haunted valleys of the Shawnee, we carry a sobering truth. The Revolution was not only a war for independence, but a war for empire. An empire not of Britain, but of America, built on the land of native nations who found themselves caught between promises and betrayals, between survival and erasure. The clatter of a spinning wheel fills a dim parlor in Massachusetts. A woman sits at it, her hands deft, the thread winding steadily. Outside, the town meeting house is alive with speeches about liberty, rights, and independence. She cannot cast a vote, cannot serve in Congress, cannot take her seat in the councils of war. And yet the cloth she spins, the bread she bakes, the sons she raises, these are the sinews that bind the Revolution together. The war was a man's world in its proclamations and battles. But beneath the surface, women carried it, often unseen. Stepped first into the world of politics from the hearth. Women who could not stand in Congress found their voices in other ways. Mercy Otis Warren of Massachusetts wrote satirical plays that skewered British officials, turning politics into biting theater. Her words flowed from her pen to the public imagination, shaping opinion as surely as any speech. Abigail Adams, writing letters to her husband John, urged him to remember the ladies when building the new republic, warning that if men refused, women might foment a rebellion of our own. Her plea was not heeded, but it lingers still, a whisper of demands yet to come. And in towns and villages, women gathered in what came to be known as spinning bees. Imagine the sight, rows of women working wheels in unison, producing homespun cloth to boycott British imports. Their labor was protest made tangible, thread by thread weaving defiance into daily life. But politics alone did not consume them. Survival did. When men marched to join Washington's army, women became the heads of farms, shops, households. A New England woman rose before dawn to milk cows, cut wood, mend fences, tend fields, work once divided, now hers alone. In Virginia, a planter's wife oversaw enslaved laborers, balancing the contradiction of managing others' bondage while her husband fought for liberty. On the frontier, women defended cabins with rifles, or carried water to fields while children clung to their skirts. Imagine the strain. Every creak of a floorboard at night, every hoofbeat on the road, might bring news: her husband fallen, her son missing, her home threatened. For many women, the revolution was not banners and speeches. It was exhaustion, worry, and a silence broken only by the cries of children who did not understand why their father had gone. Yet women did not always remain in the shadows of home. Many followed the armies as camp followers. Picture a ragged procession trailing Washington's march: wives, children, widows, carrying bundles, leading oxen, hauling water. Soldiers derided them at times, but depended on them nonetheless. They washed clothes, cooked meals, mended uniforms, nursed the sick. Without them, the Continental Army might well have collapsed under hunger and disease. And sometimes they stepped directly into battle. The legend of Molly Pitcher tells of a woman, Mary Ludwig Hayes by some accounts, who carried water to cool cannons at the Battle of Monmouth. When her husband fell wounded, she took his place, swabbing and firing the gun under blazing sun. Other women disguised themselves as men, enlisting under false names. Deborah Sampson of Massachusetts bound her chest, took up a musket, and fought for years before her secret was discovered. These women remind us that the line between battlefield and homefront was never as clear as the records suggest. Not all women supported the patriot cause. In New York and the Carolinas, Loyalist wives urged sons and husbands to remain faithful to the crown. Some hid Loyalist fugitives, smuggled intelligence, or plotted escapes. For them, the revolution was upheaval, tearing communities apart. They, too, faced confiscation of property, exile, and suspicion. Women bore the burdens of loyalty, whichever side they chose. For African American women, the paradox of liberty cut deepest. Enslaved women endured the Revolution as both disruption and opportunity. Some followed their husbands or children who fled to British lines, seeking freedom under Dunmore's proclamation. Others resisted quietly, slowing their work, hiding tools, or teaching children songs of endurance. In cities, free black women like Phyllis Wheatley raised their voices in print, her poetry urging leaders to confront the hypocrisy of slavery amid their cries for liberty. Native women, too, bore the revolution's weight. As villages were burned, they carried children into the forests, rebuilt homes again and again. They negotiated for peace, urged warriors to fight or to lay down arms, worked the fields when men were away. Their strength held nations together even as the war sought to unravel them. And then there is the matter of memory. After the war, men were hailed as heroes, their names etched into marble, their deeds recorded in histories. Women were thanked, often, in private letters, praised for sacrifice, but rarely given public recognition. A soldier might receive a pension. A widow might receive a token. But the spinning wheels, the empty chairs at supper, the water carried at Monmouth, the disguised musket in a young woman's hand, these too were acts of revolution, though history often passed them by. Imagine, at the end of the war, a woman standing on the threshold of her farm. The fields are ragged, the barn half collapsed, the house worn thin. Her husband returns, thinner, older, eyes shadowed by battle. They embrace. But behind her relief lies a truth: she has kept this place alive, fed the children, held the line. He will be remembered as a veteran. She will not. Yet without her, there would be nothing to return to. The revolution, then, was not only muskets and declarations. It was bread baked, fields plowed, letters written, cloth spun, wounds bandaged, courage shown in silence and in fury. Women, barred from the councils, nonetheless shaped the struggle in every kitchen, every camp, every whispered word. Their legacy is quieter than the clash of arms, but no less real. For when the revolution ended, and the Republic was born, the question Abigail Adams had posed remained, hovering like smoke. Remember the ladies. The men did not. But the memory lingered, waiting for the day it would blaze into fire. The year is 1776. Picture the harbor of Boston, or what remains of it after the siege has broken. Ragged American troops, thin from hunger, trudge away under Washington's command. They have won a victory of sorts, driving the British fleet away. But muskets are scarce, powder scarcer still. Soldiers march barefoot, their feet wrapped in rags. The fledgling nation shouts of liberty, yet its army teeters on collapse. Across the sea, in Versailles, chandeliers glitter over polished marble floors. Courtiers whisper beneath painted ceilings. France, humiliated by its loss in the 7 Years' War, watches with sharp interest as Britain grapples with its colonies. The chance for revenge gleams like a blade unsheathed. But to gamble openly is dangerous. France waits, watches, wonders, can the Americans endure long enough to be worth the risk? The lifeline begins not with cannons, but with whispers. Imagine a dim cafe in Paris, smoke curling from pipes, the murmur of voices thick with intrigue. There sits Silas Deane, an American envoy, pretending to be a merchant, while secretly negotiating with French officials. In his pocket are letters from Congress, begging for weapons, powder, uniforms, anything. Across the table, French agents nod cautious. Officially, France is at peace with Britain. But quietly, through the shadowy network of Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, playwright, schemer, and patriot in his own right, ships begin to sail. They carry muskets stamped with royal markings filed off, cannons hidden beneath barrels of cloth, powder packed into crates marked as sugar. By the time Washington holds his ground at Trenton and Princeton in the winter of 1776–77, French muskets are already in American hands. Each volley fired in those icy battles may as well have echoed in the halls of Versailles. Still, France hesitates. Aid in secret is one thing, war with Britain is another. Ministers debate furiously. Some warn that the Americans are too weak, their cause too fragile. Why risk another ruinous war? Others argue that weakening Britain is worth the gamble. At the heart of the intrigue stands one man who will become a legend, the Marquis de Lafayette. Picture him, young, only 19, heir to immense wealth, yet restless, hungry for glory. He hears of the American cause, reads of liberty, and is swept away by visions of honor. Against the king's orders, he purchases a ship with his own fortune and sails across the Atlantic. The voyage is perilous. Britain hunts for such vessels. But he arrives, lanky and earnest, offering his sword to Washington. The commander, wary of European adventurers, sees something different in Lafayette, a sincerity, a zeal. The bond they form will become father to son, mentor to protege. And through Lafayette, France's interest in America deepens from cold calculation into passionate alliance. But France will not leap until America proves it can stand. That proof comes in 1777, in the thick woods of New York, at Saratoga. Imagine the scene: red-coated British soldiers, thousands strong, march through tangled forests, harried by American riflemen. General John Burgoyne, proud and stubborn, expects loyalist support and swift victory. Instead, his army is strangled by wilderness, supply lines cut, morale crumbling. American forces, led by Horatio Gates, and crucially, by the fiery genius of Benedict Arnold, press hard. The battles rage at Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, smoke clinging to the trees, cannons booming across the Hudson. At last, surrounded, Burgoyne surrenders his entire army. The news races across the ocean. At Versailles, ministers smile behind their powdered wigs. America has shown it can win. Now France can move from whispers to open war. In 1778, the alliance is sealed. France recognizes American independence. Treaties are signed, of commerce, of alliance, of friendship. It is a moment electrifying to the colonists. For the first time, their rebellion is backed by one of the greatest powers on earth. And what France brings is more than promises. Ships, dozens of them, sleek warships with rows of cannon, set sail to challenge Britain's naval supremacy. Gold flows into American coffers. Uniforms, powder, bayonets arrive in bulk. French officers volunteer for service, their names scattered across the rosters of the Continental Army. America, once starving and desperate, begins to breathe. But the alliance is not without tension. The French are monarchists. The Americans fight in the name of Republican liberty. Their manners clash. Washington's ragged soldiers staring at the polished boots of French officers. The French nobles sneering at the rough cabins of Valley Forge. Yet necessity binds them tighter than friendship could. Washington, cautious but pragmatic, balances diplomacy with discipline, ensuring the alliance holds. Lafayette, meanwhile, becomes the vital bridge. He throws himself into the American cause, endearing himself to soldiers, writing passionately to French ministers, urging more aid, more ships, more men. In him, the revolution finds both a champion and a symbol, Europe itself lending strength to America's fragile fight. The French war effort soon expands the revolution into a global conflict. Picture the Caribbean, where sugar islands are worth fortunes. French and British fleets clash amid turquoise waters, cannon fire thundering across the waves. In India, French forces aid local rulers against Britain. Spain joins France, striking at British positions along the Gulf of Mexico. The revolution, once a colonial rebellion, becomes part of a vast war stretching across oceans. Britain, stretched thin, finds itself fighting not just rebels but empires. And then comes the moment when the French lifeline delivers its decisive blow, Yorktown, 1781. Imagine the Chesapeake Bay, autumn light glinting off the water. French Admiral de Grasse commands a fleet that sails boldly into the bay, blocking British ships from reaching General Cornwallis. On land, French troops under Rochambeau march alongside Washington's Continentals, their drums beating in harmony. For weeks, they lay siege, cannonballs screaming into British lines, trenches dug closer and closer. At last, Cornwallis, surrounded, outnumbered, and cut off by sea, surrenders. The victory is not American alone. It is Franco-American. French ships, French soldiers, French gold, all converging to choke the British lifeline. Without France, Yorktown would have been impossible. And yet, in the afterglow of triumph, the irony remains. America won its independence with the aid of a monarchy, an absolute monarchy that embodied much of what Americans claim to reject. But history is full of such paradoxes. What mattered was survival, and in the Revolution's darkest hour, France had stretched out its hand. As the war winds down, Lafayette sails back to France, carrying with him both honor and ideas. He will fight again, in another revolution, this time in his own land, where the language of liberty he learned in America will ignite against the monarchy that once aided him. The French lifeline, then, did not end at Yorktown. It carried sparks that would soon set Europe aflame. So as we walk away from the battlefields and the council chambers, remember this: the American Revolution was never fought alone. Its lifeblood flowed not only from Boston taverns or Virginia fields, but from the harbors of Brest, the palaces of Versailles, the passion of a young marquis who believed in liberty. Without France, the fire might well have died. With France, it blazed to victory. Imagine yourself in London in 1775. The city is grey with soot, alive with the clatter of carriages, the cries of hawkers, the hum of an empire at its peak. Britain's navy commands the seas. Its red-coated regiments are trained, drilled, disciplined. Its treasury, though strained, is backed by commerce from Bengal to Barbados. Against such power, the 13 colonies seem insignificant, fractious, poorly armed, far away. To Britain's ministers, crushing the rebellion looks like a matter of time. A few months, perhaps, some predict. But what begins as a police action will grind on for 8 long years, draining coffers, fracturing politics, and exposing the limits of empire. The first reason Britain lost is deceptively simple: distance. Stand on the deck of a ship in Portsmouth Harbor, bound for America. The wind bites, the salt spray stings. Ahead lies a voyage of weeks, even months. Storms threaten, supplies spoil, men fall sick. By the time a regiment arrives in New York or Boston, orders from London are already outdated. Messages sent back take just as long. A decision in Whitehall may be months behind the reality in America. The empire's power is vast, but stretched thin by oceans. Meanwhile, American militias fight on their own ground. They know the rivers, the hills, the back roads. They can melt away into forests, strike and vanish. Britain fights with muskets and drill books. The Americans fight with knowledge of the land. But distance alone cannot explain defeat. After all, Britain had held colonies across the globe. The deeper reason lies in the sheer burden of empire. By the 1770s, Britain is not fighting only in America. The Caribbean demands constant defense, its sugar islands worth fortunes. India is a battlefield of European rivalry, with French forces stirring trouble. The Mediterranean, the Atlantic, even the Irish Sea, all demand ships and soldiers. When France, Spain, and eventually the Dutch Republic join the war, Britain finds itself beset on every side. America becomes only one front among many, and not always the most important. Imagine the Admiralty's maps, tables covered in charts and reports. 2 ships here to defend Jamaica. 4 here to watch Gibraltar. More to India. The Navy is stretched, its power diluted. America bleeds British strength, but so too does the wider world. Another reason Britain falters lies in its strategy. At first, ministers believe the rebellion is the work of a few hotheads: Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, the noisy rabble in Boston. Crush them, they think, and the colonies will fall back into line. They underestimate how deep resentment runs, how many ordinary farmers, shopkeepers, and artisans are willing to fight. When full war breaks, Britain's generals pursue cities, seizing New York, Philadelphia, Charleston. But in doing so they discover a hard truth: capturing towns does not capture hearts. Each time the redcoats march out, the countryside erupts behind them. Guerrilla bands harass supply lines. Militia ambush patrols. Britain wins battles, but loses control. The Southern strategy, launched in 1778, aims to rally loyalists in the Carolinas and Georgia. At first it works. Charleston falls, loyalist militias rise. But the rebellion in the South is a civil war, brutal and personal. Patriots strike back, and soon neighbor slays neighbor in a spiral of vengeance. The British find themselves bogged down in a swamp of skirmishes, unable to hold the loyalty they hoped to claim. Add to this the failures of leadership. General William Howe hesitates after victories, squandering chances to crush Washington's army. At Long Island, he defeats the rebels soundly, but delays pursuit, allowing Washington's forces to escape under cover of night. At Brandywine and Germantown, he beats the Continentals again, but fails to deliver a decisive blow. Critics whisper that Howe is too cautious, too fond of winter quarters, too unwilling to risk everything. His successor, General Henry Clinton, is more aggressive but also fractious, quarreling with subordinates, torn between orders from London and realities on the ground. Burgoyne's disastrous march from Canada, ending in surrender at Saratoga, reveals arrogance and overconfidence. Cornwallis, bold and talented, campaigns brilliantly in the South but overextends himself into Yorktown, where French fleets and American troops trap him in the final blow. Time and again, British commanders underestimate their opponents, overestimate loyalist support, and misjudge the terrain of both land and politics. Politics at home only deepens the cracks. In Parliament, the war divides opinion sharply. Prime Minister Lord North, loyal to King George III, presses for stern measures. But Whigs like Charles James Fox and Edmund Burke denounce the war as folly, warning that America cannot be conquered by force. Speeches ring through Westminster, newspapers rage, pamphlets fly. The war becomes not only costly in treasure and blood, but poisonous to Britain's own politics. Public support falters as taxes rise and casualties mount. British merchants, hurt by loss of trade, clamor for peace. Families mourn sons lost in a war across the ocean, a war that seems increasingly unwinnable. And all the while, the Americans endure. That is perhaps the greatest reason of all. Imagine Washington at Valley Forge in the winter of 1777-78. Snow covers the huts, men huddle in rags, hunger gnaws. Desertion threatens. Yet the army does not dissolve. Under the drilling of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, ragged soldiers learn discipline, order, confidence. By spring, they march with new precision, their spirit unbroken. Every time the British think the rebellion crushed, it rises again. Washington's genius is not in winning glorious battles. He loses as many as he wins, but in keeping the army alive. As long as it exists, the revolution breathes. And then, of course, there is France. The French alliance transforms the war, forcing Britain into global conflict, stretching its navy, supplying the Americans with the lifeline they need. At Yorktown, French ships and soldiers tip the balance. Without them, Britain might have forced a stalemate. With them, Britain faces disaster. So why did Britain lose? Because an empire stretched across oceans underestimated the will of a people fighting on their own soil. Because ministers misread rebellion as riot, and generals mistook victories for conquest. Because the burden of global war pulled Britain's strength in every direction. Because across frozen camps, smoky taverns, and bloodied fields, Americans refused to yield. In the end, Britain lost not for lack of power, but for lack of clarity. It fought a war it could not define, against a people it could not control, in a land too vast to tame. Picture London again in 1783, the bells of St. Paul's tolling under a grey sky. News of Yorktown has arrived, ministers debate, Parliament groans under defeat. An empire still mighty bows its head, not broken, but bloodied, forced to accept that its colonies have slipped away. The war is over. America is free. And Britain, for all its ships, its armies, its wealth, has lost. The night is damp at Cambridge, Massachusetts, in July of 1775. A tall Virginian stands before the ragged regiments gathered after Bunker Hill. His coat is fine, his bearing stiff, his expression grave. This is George Washington, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He looks at the men, farmers with muskets, boys in ill-fitting coats, veterans with powder horns nearly empty, and feels the weight of expectation settle onto his shoulders. He had not sought this command with eagerness. Only months earlier, he had sat in the Second Continental Congress, silent for long stretches, towering but reserved. When talk turned to appointing a general, his name emerged not from his own lips but from others, partly for his reputation, partly for the symbolism. A Virginian leading a New England army would knit the colonies together. Washington accepted, but in private he confessed to friends, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." That doubt would follow him for years. And yet, in doubt lay his greatness. Washington's genius was not in grand victories. In truth, he lost more battles than he won. At Brooklyn Heights, at Brandywine, at Germantown, he tasted defeat. His troops fled in panic more than once. Congress fumed. Critics whispered that he was unfit. But Washington understood something deeper. Wars are not won only by battles, but by endurance. His task was not to crush Britain in the field. It was to keep the revolution alive long enough for Britain to tire, for allies to come, for a chance to turn. He fought not to win swiftly, but to never be destroyed. Imagine him in the bitter retreat across New Jersey in late 1776. Snow falls, muskets rust, men desert by the hundreds. British forces chase close behind, drums echoing through the frozen air. Washington rides at the rear, cloak whipping, face set. At every farm they pass, he begs for food, clothes, reinforcements. His army is shrinking to a shadow. Many believe the revolution is finished. And yet, in this darkest hour, Washington strikes back. On Christmas night, he leads a desperate crossing of the icy Delaware River. Picture the scene: boats creaking against floes of ice, oars straining, men shivering, Washington standing tall in the prow. At dawn, they fall upon the Hessian garrison at Trenton, surprising them, capturing nearly 1,000. Days later, he wins again at Princeton. These victories are small in scale, but enormous in spirit. They tell the world, and his own weary men, the cause lives. Washington's reluctance showed not only in his doubts, but in his discipline. He refused to seize power for himself. Unlike many generals in history, he did not dream of dictatorship. His letters show a man constantly reminding himself that his authority came from Congress, from the people. He begged for supplies, argued with politicians, cursed their slowness, but he never tried to rule them. Even when soldiers muttered of replacing Congress with military strength, Washington crushed the idea. At Newburgh in 1783, when officers furious over unpaid wages plotted mutiny, Washington appeared before them. He pulled from his pocket a letter, then paused, fumbling for spectacles. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service, and now I am going blind." The room fell silent. Hardened officers wept. The mutiny dissolved. Washington had saved the Republic before it was even born, not with cannon, but with humility. Yet he was no saint carved in stone. He could be harsh, even cold. His temper, when unleashed, was formidable. He brooded over slights, despised incompetence, and demanded obedience. He struggled with his own contradictions, champion of liberty, yet enslaver of hundreds at Mount Vernon. He longed for private life, yet answered every call to public duty. He was, in truth, deeply human. And perhaps that is why his endurance meant so much. Walk with him at Valley Forge, the bitter winter of 1777-78. Snow crunches under boots, the air stinks of smoke and sickness. Men lie in huts without shoes, without blankets. Horses starve. Some soldiers eat leather boiled into broth. Death hovers like frost. Washington rides through the camp, cloak drawn tight, face set with grief and determination. He shares the suffering, refuses to abandon the men. His presence alone, grim, enduring, keeps the army from dissolving. When Baron von Steuben arrives to drill the troops, Washington backs him fully, demanding order where there had been chaos. By spring, the army marches with new precision. Valley Forge does not break them. It steels them. Washington's leadership is not glorious, but it is unyielding. And through it all, he formed bonds that shaped the revolution. With Lafayette, he shared a fatherly affection, calling him, "My son." With Alexander Hamilton, he quarreled yet relied upon his brilliance. With Nathanael Greene, he found a general whose strategy of retreat and survival mirrored his own. Washington's gift was not genius alone. It was the ability to inspire loyalty, to keep a fractious army, and a fractious Congress, bound together. At Yorktown, when Cornwallis surrendered, Washington did not exult. He stood tall, grave, silent, as though understanding the fragility of the moment. Victory had come, but at immense cost. He knew peace would be as difficult to secure as war. And when that peace was finally signed, when the British departed, Washington did something almost unimaginable. He resigned. In December 1783, he appeared before Congress in Annapolis, handed back his commission, and returned to Mount Vernon. Kings seize power. Generals cling to it. Washington laid it down. A reluctant hero to the last. Picture him at home, walking the fields of Mount Vernon, longing at last for peace. Yet his peace would not last. The nation, fragile and divided, would call on him again. And again, reluctantly, he would answer. So why does Washington endure in memory above all others? Not because he was flawless. Not because he was brilliant at every turn. But because he held the line when all seemed lost. Because he resisted the temptations of power. Because he embodied endurance, humility, and resolve. In his reluctance lay his strength. In his doubts lay his humanity. And in his endurance lay the revolution's survival. The campfire flickers low at Saratoga, October 1777. The battle rages in the woods beyond, musket smoke clinging to the trees, cannon fire booming through the valley. A rider gallops into camp, shouting that the left flank falters. General Gates, cautious, hesitates. And then a man bursts from the tent, fury in his eyes, sword flashing. It is Benedict Arnold. Against orders, against reason, he hurls himself into the fight. Picture him riding into the smoke, his horse lathered, his voice ringing. He rallies broken lines, drives men forward, seizes the moment. A musket ball shatters his leg, but he fights on, bleeding in the mud, until the British lines break. Burgoyne surrenders days later, handing over an entire army. It is the victory that convinces France to join the war, the turning point of the revolution. And in the mud of that battlefield lies the shattered leg of Benedict Arnold, the hero. Without him, Saratoga may have been lost. Without Saratoga, perhaps the revolution itself. But let us step back. Who was this man before he became a traitor? Benedict Arnold was born in 1741 in Norwich, Connecticut. His family was once prosperous, but decline set in, his father drank, debts mounted. Young Arnold carried ambition like a burning coal. He became a successful merchant, daring in trade, bold in temperament. When the revolution began, he he leapt into the cause with fiery zeal. In 1775, he joined Ethan Allen in capturing Fort Ticonderoga, seizing precious cannons that would later fortify Boston. He led a grueling march through the Maine wilderness toward Quebec, hacking through snow and swamp, men starving, some eating dogs and leather to survive. At Quebec he charged the walls, musket ball tearing into his leg. The assault failed, but his courage burned into memory. Washington admired him, soldiers revered him. He was brave to the point of recklessness, ambitious to the point of arrogance. Yet the seeds of bitterness were already sown. Arnold was passed over for promotion, slighted by Congress, undermined by rivals. He was proud, sensitive, quick to anger. He felt, again and again, that his sacrifices were unrecognized, his enemies rewarded. And he was not entirely blameless. His temper, his quarrels, his sharp dealings with money earned him enemies as swiftly as friends. At Philadelphia, after the British withdrew in 1778, Arnold was appointed military governor. The city was restless, politics poisonous. Arnold lived lavishly, entertained in style, and fell in love with Peggy Shippen, a young woman from a prominent Loyalist family. She was beautiful, charming, and connected to British officers. Their marriage bound Arnold to circles where loyalty to the crown lingered. Accusations soon followed. Congress charged him with corruption and profiteering. He faced courts-martial, reprimands, public disgrace. His pride, already raw, curdled into rage. He had given blood, risked all, and now he was treated like a criminal. The hero of Quebec and Saratoga felt himself dishonored. And so, the slow turn toward treason began. Through Peggy Shippen, Arnold came into contact with Major John Andre, a dashing British officer and spymaster. Secret letters, written in invisible ink, passed between them. Arnold offered what Britain most desired: West Point, the strategic fortress on the Hudson River. For £20,000 and a British commission, he would deliver it into their hands. Imagine the night he signed his name to betrayal. The room is dark, a candle guttering low. His wounded leg aches, his pride burns hotter still. To him, it is not treason but justice, revenge on a Congress that scorned him, on rivals who maligned him. Let them call me traitor, he might have thought. I know the truth, they betrayed me first. The plot nearly succeeded. Arnold took command of West Point, quietly weakening its defenses, preparing for its surrender. But fate intervened. Major Andre, carrying incriminating papers, was captured by Patriot militia. The plot unraveled. Washington, on his way to visit Arnold, discovered the betrayal hours too late. Arnold fled, racing to a British ship on the Hudson. He escaped. Andre was hanged as a spy. The fortress was saved. And America had found its Judas. The name Benedict Arnold spread through the colonies like poison. Soldiers spat it as a curse. Families whispered it as a warning. The man who had bled for the cause was now the symbol of betrayal. His earlier heroism was swallowed by his treason, erased from memory. Yet history is rarely so simple. Arnold did not vanish into obscurity. He fought for Britain, leading raids against his own countrymen in Virginia and Connecticut. He burned towns, plundered supplies, struck with ruthless efficiency. But even the British distrusted him, never granting full command. Loyalists saw him as useful, but tainted. Patriots saw him as damned. He belonged to no side, honored by none. After the war, he fled to England, then to Canada, then back to England again. He tried business, failed, quarreled with officials, sank into obscurity. He died in 1801, sick and embittered, muttering of battles fought long ago. So why does his name endure not as hero, but traitor? Perhaps because betrayal cuts deeper than defeat. Washington's losses could be forgiven, even honored. But Arnold had been one of their own, brave, brilliant, essential, and he turned. His treason was a mirror, showing the revolution's fragility, the price of pride and resentment. And yet, if we look closely, we see both sides of him: the man who nearly starved in the Maine wilderness, who stormed Quebec, who saved Saratoga, and the man who, in bitterness, sold West Point. Hero and traitor bound together. Imagine standing by his grave in London, far from the fields where he fought. The stone is plain, the name half forgotten. And yet, in America, his name still burns. Not as it once did, in songs of praise, but in curses, in the shadow of betrayal. Benedict Arnold, who gave the Revolution one of its greatest victories, and nearly delivered its greatest defeat. Picture a road outside Boston, April 1775. Dawn is breaking, the air crisp with spring. British regulars march in neat columns, their scarlet coats gleaming. Drums beat the steady rhythm of empire. They are trained, disciplined, confident. And yet from behind stone walls, from groves of trees, from windows of farmhouses, shots crack. Militiamen, farmers and blacksmiths strike and fade. The column stretches thin, grows ragged, men fall in ditches. By the time the redcoats stagger back into Boston, nearly 300 are dead or wounded. This was not how wars were meant to be fought. Europeans prided themselves on order, on lines and volleys, on honor in the open field. But America's war was different. From the very first day, it became a war of ambush and improvisation. The land itself invited such fighting. Dense forests, rolling hills, endless rivers, terrain where discipline mattered less than cunning. Patriots learned to use every hedge, every ravine. Muskets fired from cover, powder horns emptied, men melted back into woods. Some British officers scoffed at this as cowardice. Others muttered darkly of ungentlemanly war. But it bled them just the same. Now step with me into the swamps of the South. The year is 1780. Charleston has fallen, the British hold Savannah, and the Southern cause seems broken. But in the Carolina backcountry, resistance burns hot. Out of the cypress and cane rides a wiry man known as Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. Picture him and his band, 50 men at most, ragged clothes, mismatched muskets. They know the swamps like a map written in water. By day, they vanish into shadows beneath moss-draped trees. By night they strike, slashing supply lines, ambushing patrols, freeing prisoners, vanishing again. British dragoons curse his name, chase him endlessly, never catch him. Marion becomes legend, proof that the war cannot be tamed. He is not alone. Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, fights with equal ferocity, striking British outposts, rallying militia after every defeat. Daniel Morgan masters the use of sharpshooters and double lines, as at Cowpens in 1781. He places militia in front to fire a few volleys, then retreat, luring the British into a trap where disciplined Continentals and cavalry wait. The result: a crushing American victory, achieved not by rigid order but by cunning use of militia and maneuver. Even outside the South, guerrilla war flared. On the frontiers, in the Mohawk Valley, militias clashed with loyalist raiders and their native allies in brutal, intimate fighting. Cabins burned, families scattered, the war becoming neighbor against neighbor. No grand battles here, but a grinding war of raids, ambushes, reprisals. And beyond the colonies, men like George Rogers Clark pushed westward, capturing British outposts in the Ohio Valley with small bands of riflemen. His victories, won by stealth and audacity, extended American claims far beyond the Appalachians. To understand this kind of war, imagine yourself as one of those militiamen. You are no professional soldier. You tend fields by day, hear rumors of redcoats in the evening, and take your musket down from above the hearth. You kiss your wife, step into the night, join your neighbors by the meeting house. By dawn, you are crouched behind a stone wall, heart pounding, waiting for the column to pass. The battle lasts minutes. Smoke, shouting, the smell of powder. Then silence. You scatter back to your farm, melt once again into ordinary life. Tomorrow, you are a farmer. Today, you were a soldier. This was the revolution for thousands. Not parades and ranks, but sudden violence, fleeting, deadly. British officers found themselves trapped in an endless cycle. Every victory brought only temporary quiet. Every march into the countryside stirred up resistance anew. "We may march over the country in all directions," one officer complained. "But as soon as we are gone, the rebels swarm back." It was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. And the tactics were not only on land. At sea, too, Americans fought unconventionally. With few ships to match Britain's navy, they turned to privateers, fast, lightly armed vessels licensed to prey on British commerce. Imagine a merchant ship on the Atlantic, sails full, holds heavy with sugar or tea. Out of the mist, a sloop closes fast, its crew lean and hungry. Cannon roar, grappling hooks fly, men swarm the deck. The prize is seized, its cargo sold, its loss felt in London's counting houses. Thousands of such strikes strained British trade, forcing the Empire to guard its convoys at enormous cost. And then there was John Paul Jones, the fiery Scotsman who became America's most famous naval captain. His daring raids along the British coast shocked the Empire itself. In 1779, commanding the Bonhomme Richard, he grappled with HMS Serapis in a desperate battle. When called to surrender, Jones shouted his immortal defiance. "I have not yet begun to fight!" Hours later, the Serapis struck her colors. Jones's ship sank, but his legend soared. It was naval guerrilla war, reckless, audacious, devastating to British pride. Guerrilla war, then, was more than skirmishes. It was a spirit, a refusal to fight by the Empire's rules. It made every road, every farm, every inlet a battlefield. It made occupation impossible, even after victories. And it blurred the lines between soldier and civilian. Farmers one day, fighters the next. Housewives smuggling intelligence, teenagers carrying powder, taverns doubling as headquarters. The revolution was not waged only by standing armies. It was led by entire communities who turned daily life into resistance. But guerrilla war was brutal, too. In the Carolinas, militia wars descended into vengeance, prisoners shot, homes torched, families terrorized. Loyalists struck patriots, patriots struck loyalists, cruelty answering cruelty. This was civil war in its rawest form, a neighbor's musket aimed at a neighbor's chest. The revolution's memory often cloaked itself in glory, but in the back country it was soaked in blood and ash. Still, without these unconventional tactics, the revolution might well have failed. Washington's main army held the cause alive, but the militias and partisans kept the British constantly bleeding. Every ambush, every burned convoy, every seized ship wore away the Empire's strength. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Picture Cornwallis in the South, 1781. His army marches through hostile country, loyalist support thinner than promised, supplies dwindling. Every road harassed, every forage party ambushed, every message intercepted. He grows weary, frustrated, desperate for rest. That desperation leads him to Yorktown, where French fleets and Washington's army finally closed the trap. Guerrilla war, relentless and small, helped drive him into the jaws of decisive defeat. The revolution was won not only in great sieges or alliances, but in shadows, by farmers who fought behind fences, sailors who seized prizes, partisans who struck in swamps. They turned the might of empire into exhaustion. And so, as we leave the ambushes and swamps, the forests and privateer decks, we carry this truth: America did not win by fighting Britain's war. It won by fighting its own, messy, improvised, unorthodox, and unstoppable. We've just slipped through the smoke of ambushes, felt the sting of swamp mosquitoes beside Francis Marion, heard the roar of John Paul Jones's cannon in the spray of the sea. Guerrilla war showed how the revolution was fought in shadows and sudden strikes. But there were other shadows still, quieter, more dangerous. Wars are not only won with muskets and cannon. They are won with secrets, with lies, with whispers carried in the dark. Let us step seamlessly now into the hidden world of the spy networks. The year is 1778. The city is New York, occupied, garrisoned, ruled by Britain. Redcoats patrol the streets. Loyalist merchants toast the king in crowded taverns. But beneath the surface, another world stirs. Messages pass hand to hand. Invisible ink stains paper. Couriers ride at night, slipping past sentries. Every word, every whisper may tilt the balance of the war. This is the world of the culper ring, Washington's eyes and ears inside enemy territory. Imagine yourself as Abraham Woodhull, a farmer from Setauket, Long Island. Outwardly, you are loyal, quiet, cautious. Inwardly, you are culper senior, risking your neck to smuggle intelligence from New York to Washington. You walk the streets of the occupied city, noting troop movements, overhearing gossip, scanning the harbor for sails. Each detail, written in code, will make its way through couriers, across the Sound, into Washington's hands. One careless move, one slip of the tongue, and you will hang from a British gallows. His partner, Robert Townsend, Culper Jr., poses as a loyalist merchant. He lingers in coffee houses, sips ale with British officers, listens while they boast or complain. To them, he is harmless, even useful. To Washington, he is invaluable. Through Townsend's reports, Washington learns of British plans, troop strengths, naval movements. The messages are hidden in the most ordinary things. Notes tucked into barrels, written in invisible ink that appears only when heated. Ciphers disguise names and places, numbers stand for letters. Anna Strong, another member of the ring, signals with her laundry line, a black petticoat to show a courier has arrived, handkerchiefs arranged to mark the landing site. The most ordinary details, a basket of clothes, a crate of goods, become tools of war. Washington himself prized intelligence above almost anything else. The necessity of procuring good intelligence, he wrote, is apparent and need not be further urged. All that remains for me to add is, that you keep the whole matter as secret as possible. He did not romanticize spies. He knew their value, and their danger. But espionage was not only the work of quiet farmers and merchants. Some operated in bolder fashion. James Armistead Lafayette, an enslaved man in Virginia, volunteered as a double agent. He entered Cornwallis's camp posing as a runaway slave, serving as an orderly and courier. The British trusted him, used him to carry messages, never realizing he carried those same messages to Lafayette and Washington. His intelligence proved crucial at Yorktown. When the war ended, he gained his freedom, adopting the name of the general he had served. Others were caught, paid the price. None more famously than Nathan Hale. In 1776, this young schoolteacher volunteered to slip into New York and gather intelligence. He was captured quickly, papers on his person. The British hanged him within days. On the gallows, he is said to have declared, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." His mission failed, but his words became legend, inspiring generations to come. British intelligence was no less active. They ran networks of loyalist informants, bribed deserters, sowed disinformation. Major John Andre, elegant and clever, orchestrated many of their schemes, until his capture with Benedict Arnold's papers ended his life at the gallows. In the South, loyalist spies betrayed patriot hideouts, guiding British raids. Espionage was a two-edged sword, cutting both ways, leaving suspicion thick as smoke. Imagine the tension of living in a world where anyone might be a spy. A neighbor who seems loyal may be passing messages at night. A tavern maid carrying ale may overhear conversations, carry them to the other side. Letters are opened, codes broken, loyalties doubted. Trust becomes as rare as powder. The tools of the spy trade were crude by modern standards, yet ingenious for their time. Invisible ink, made from lemon juice or sympathetic chemicals, revealed under heat. Cipher wheels turned letters into numbers, numbers into symbols. Dead drops, hollow tree trunks, loose stones in walls, held folded notes. Couriers rode at night, slipping through British lines, hiding messages in their boots or sewing them into clothes. It was a game of patience, deception, and nerve. And it mattered. Through the Culper Ring, Washington learned of British plans to counterfeit continental currency, a scheme that could have wrecked the fragile economy. He discovered the movements of troops, the timing of raids, the intent of commanders. Spies saved lives, battles, perhaps the revolution itself. But espionage was not glorious. It was lonely, dangerous, often thankless. Capture meant torture or hanging. Even success brought little recognition. Secrecy demanded silence. Many spies died unknown, their names erased, their work buried. Only long after the war did fragments of their stories emerge from dusty archives. Picture Washington in his tent, candle burning low, reading a coded message freshly arrived from New York. His face is grave, his eyes weary. Outside, soldiers cough in the cold night, horses stamp in the mud. He knows that what he holds in his hand, mere scraps of paper, may matter as much as any musket or cannon. For wars are fought with steel, but won with knowledge. And so, when we think of the Revolution, we must remember not only the battles, but the shadows. The farmer who hung laundry in code. The merchant who scribbled numbers in a cipher. The enslaved man who carried freedom in his double life. The schoolteacher who died with regret only that he could not serve more. Their war was fought in silence, in whispers, in shadows. But without them, the revolution might never have survived the light. We carry the story forward, keeping the pace steady, the thread unbroken. We've just slipped through the hidden world of spies, codes written in invisible ink, laundry lines signaling secrets, men and women risking their lives for whispers in the dark. But not all shadows of the revolution were so subtle. Some were drenched in fire, blood, and cruelty. For if we peel away the romantic glow of liberty, what we find beneath is raw, merciless, often horrifying. The revolution was not only muskets and ideals. It was brutality, neighbors turning on neighbors, vengeance taken in barns and fields, cruelty hidden behind the banner of freedom. Let us step now into that darker ground, the brutality of revolution. Imagine a quiet New England village, 1776. The church bell tolls not for worship, but for justice. A crowd gathers on the green, faces set with grim determination. At the center, bound and trembling, stands a man accused of loyalism. He has refused to sign the oath, spoken too freely of the king. The punishment is ready, a barrel of tar bubbling over a fire, feathers waiting in a sack. The crowd jeers as the hot tar is poured over him, feathers sticking to his blistered skin. He is paraded through the streets, mocked, spat upon, his dignity destroyed. This is not battlefield valor. This is terror, inflicted by neighbors upon their own. Such scenes were not rare. The revolution tore communities apart, turning differences of opinion into sentences of exile or death. In Massachusetts, Loyalist estates were seized, families driven from their homes. In New York, mobs smashed windows, burned barns, attacked shops. Across the South, militias clashed in savage skirmishes where prisoners were shot, houses torched, women and children left destitute. The revolution was, in truth, a civil war. 1/3 of the population was loyalist or neutral. For them, the war brought not liberation but persecution. To side with the crown was to risk everything: property confiscated, neighbors' hatred, the threat of mob justice. And the patriots did not hold a monopoly on cruelty. British troops, hardened by years of war, often treated rebels not as soldiers but as criminals. Prisons swelled with captives, many held in horrific conditions. none more infamous than the prison ships of New York Harbor. Picture the hulking carcass of the HMS Jersey, anchored in the East River. Its decks are rotting, its hold foul with stench. Inside are hundreds of American prisoners, packed tight, starved, racked with disease. Air is scarce, water foul, rations meager. Each morning, corpses are carried out and dumped into the harbor. More Americans died in those prison ships than in battle. To enter the Jersey was to step into a floating hell. On the frontiers, brutality reached new extremes. Raids by Loyalist and native allies struck settlements with fire and tomahawk. Patriot militias retaliated with equal ferocity, burning villages, slaughtering women and children. In the Mohawk Valley, in Kentucky, in the Carolinas, the war was fought house by house, cabin by cabin, with no quarter asked or given. In one account, after the Battle of Waxhaws in 1780, British dragoons under Banastre Tarleton cut down surrendering Americans, their cries ignored in a frenzy of slaughter. Tarleton's quarter became a phrase whispered in fear and rage, fueling patriot vengeance. Even within the patriot cause, suspicion bred cruelty. Mutiny was punished with lashes, deserters hanged before their comrades. Washington himself ordered executions to enforce discipline. A soldier caught sleeping on sentry duty could be shot at dawn, an example to the rest. Liberty demanded obedience, and obedience was wrung from men through fear as often as through inspiration. And then there were the civilians, those who did not fight, yet bore the revolution's harshest burdens. Women saw their homes ransacked by both armies, their fields trampled, their children hungry. Refugees fled burning towns, trudging roads with nothing but what they could carry. Enslaved men and women, caught between promises of freedom from Britain and bondage under patriots, often found themselves betrayed by both, punished for seeking liberty, punished again for staying. Imagine a small farm in Virginia, its fences broken, its livestock driven off by soldiers of one side, its grain seized days later by soldiers of the other. The family watches as their hard-won livelihood is devoured by a war not of their choosing. For them, the revolution is not banners and glory, but ruin. The brutality also lived in memory, festering long after muskets fell silent. Neighbors who once shared pews in church now refused to look one another in the eye. Families were split by loyalty, wounds that never healed. Loyalists driven into exile carried bitterness to Canada, to the Caribbean, to England itself. Patriots, triumphant, justified their cruelty as necessary, but even they bore scars of vengeance taken too far. And yet, through the horror, the revolution endured. Perhaps because men and women learned to harden themselves, to survive amid cruelty. Perhaps because ideals can burn even in the darkest times. But the truth remains, liberty was not born clean. It was birthed in tar and feathers, in smoke rising from burned villages, in the groans of prisoners dying in fetid holds. So when we speak of the revolution, we must speak not only of Washington's dignity, Lafayette's zeal, or Jefferson's words. We must also speak of the mobs on the village green, the prison ships in New York Harbor, the raids in the frontier woods, the neighbor's musket aimed at a neighbor's chest. Freedom came, but it came drenched in brutality. We have just lingered in the darkest shadows of the Revolution, where liberty was carved through blood and cruelty, tar and feathers, prison ships, raids that left villages smoldering. But even brutality, relentless as it was, could not last forever. Muskets would eventually fall silent, smoke clear from the hills, and the world would turn its eyes to negotiation tables rather than battlefields. Victory had been won in principle at Yorktown, but the war was not truly over until pen met parchment, until kings and ministers acknowledged what had once seemed impossible, that the United States existed. Let us now step seamlessly into the Treaty of Paris, 1783. Picture a cold, gray morning in Paris, the year 1782. The city's streets hum with gossip of war and empire. In a quiet house along the Rue Jacob, American envoys gather around a fire. They are weary from years of struggle, their clothes plainer than the silk coats of European diplomats, their accents provincial in the salons of Versailles. And yet, they carry with them the weight of a new nation's hopes. There is Benjamin Franklin, gray-haired, witty, his spectacles perched low. He is adored in Paris, his image hung in homes, his face printed on snuff-boxes, his presence a symbol of wisdom and rustic charm. There is John Adams, sharp and patient, stubborn in negotiation. There is John Jay, younger, calm, deliberate, a master of quiet persuasion. Together they represent a fragile republic that has, against all odds, survived. But to survive is not enough. They must now secure recognition, borders, peace. And they sit in Paris knowing full well, the revolution can still be lost at the table, even after victory on the field. Across from them stand Britain's representatives. Lord Shelburne, Prime Minister, knows the Empire is weary, bled of treasure, racked by defeats in America, the Caribbean, India, at sea against France and Spain. Parliament clamors for peace. Merchants demand the reopening of trade. Families demand their sons' return. But Britain will not yield everything easily. If America is to be free, the price must be negotiated, detail by detail. The talks are slow, delicate, tangled in layers of distrust. France, America's great ally, expects to guide the process. Spain has its own demands, coveting Gibraltar and lands in North America. Yet Adams and Jay, wary of European ambitions, push for America to negotiate directly with Britain. Franklin, the diplomat, smiles, charms, maneuvers, using silence as much as words, patience as much as persuasion. Behind closed doors, maps are unrolled. Borders are debated. Britain at first envisions a smaller America, hemmed in along the coast. But the Americans press hard, insisting on the Mississippi River as their western boundary. They want fishing rights off Newfoundland, access to markets, recognition of debts, restitution for loyalists. Each point is a struggle, each clause a battlefield of words. Imagine Franklin, leaning back in his chair, his spectacles catching the candlelight. He does not raise his voice, does not argue like Adams. Instead, he lets silence stretch, lets the British diplomats grow uneasy, then cuts through with wit or with wisdom. Our cause, he reminds them, is not just ours, but the cause of liberty. It is theater, persuasion, philosophy, all turned into tools of statecraft. John Adams, in contrast, hammers points with relentless force. He demands recognition not as favor but as right. His temper sometimes flares, but his persistence yields ground. John Jay, quiet and precise, keeps the negotiations steady, bridging gaps between Franklin's charm and Adams's fire. Together, unlikely as they are as a team, they shape the future of a nation. And so, piece by piece, the treaty takes form. Britain recognizes the independence of the United States, the words that once would have been unthinkable now written plainly on parchment. The new nation's borders stretch from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, from Canada in the north to Florida in the south. Fishing rights are secured. Debts owed to British merchants are acknowledged. Loyalists are to be treated fairly, though in practice many will never see restitution. The details may seem dry, but consider what they meant. A people once dismissed as rebellious subjects were now declared sovereign, equal, free. An empire that had ruled the seas, that had scoffed at the notion of American independence, now conceded it in writing. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed. In that moment, the war is over, not just in spirit, but in law. Bells ring, cannons boom, celebrations erupt in America. Farmers return to fields, merchants to shops, soldiers to families long left waiting. The revolution, once fragile and desperate, has birthed a nation recognized by the world. But the treaty is also a document of compromise, of shadows as well as triumph. Britain retains Canada, holds on to its forts in the Great Lakes region, setting the stage for future tension. Loyalists, promised protection, often find none, their homes gone, their lives uprooted. Native nations, not even consulted, discover their lands traded away without their consent. Spain gains Florida, France gains satisfaction in Britain's humiliation, but America alone claims the greater prize, independence. Imagine standing in Philadelphia when the news arrives. The streets fill with crowds, church bells peal, men embrace, women weep. In taverns, toasts are raised. To Washington! To Franklin! To liberty! Yet beneath the joy lies unease. The war is over, but what will peace bring? 13 colonies must now live as one nation. The ideals of freedom must confront the realities of slavery, of divided interests, of fragile unity. The revolution is won, but the experiment has only begun. The Treaty of Paris is more than parchment. It is a hinge in history, swinging open the door to a new world. For Britain, it marks the loss of its greatest colonies, a wound to empire. For America, it is birth and burden both. For France, it is triumph and debt, a spark that will soon ignite revolution in their own streets. The ink of Paris drips across continents, reshaping not only a war, but the future of the Atlantic world. So as we step away from the negotiating table, the maps folded, the quills set down, remember this: the revolution did not end at Yorktown. It ended here in Paris, with words as powerful as cannon fire. And those words, once signed, carried liberty from fragile dream to recognized reality. We have just left the treaty tables of Paris, the ink still drying, the bells still ringing in Philadelphia as crowds rejoice at the news of peace. Independence has been won, the United States recognized. But as the cheers echo, something else begins to stir, a quieter truth, heavier than celebration. Because while the revolution had ended in victory, it was far from complete. Many remained outside the circle of liberty. Many promises remained unfulfilled. What had been declared with such certainty, that all men are created equal, still waited to be lived. Let us move now, seamlessly, into the unfinished revolution. Imagine standing on a village green in New England in the autumn of 1783. Soldiers have come home, muskets stacked, fields calling for harvest. Children climb on fences to watch their fathers return. Women embrace husbands long thought lost. There is joy, yes, but also silence. The widows receive no comfort but memory. Families divided by loyalist sympathies still refuse to speak across fences. And in the fields beyond the village, African Americans, enslaved still, continue their labor as though nothing has changed. The revolution promised freedom, but who was counted among the free? For African Americans, the answer was bitter. In the North, seeds of emancipation were sown. Massachusetts courts declared slavery incompatible with the new Constitution. Pennsylvania passed a law for gradual abolition. Vermont had outlawed it from the start. And yet, across the South, slavery tightened its grip. Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, their prosperity remained chained to bondage. Washington returned to Mount Vernon to find enslaved workers still tilling his fields. Jefferson, who wrote of equality, remained a master of hundreds. The Revolution had spoken of liberty, but for millions it delivered only continuity of chains. Some who had fought, who had marched in continental ranks, gained freedom. Others who fled to British lines lived on in Canada, or in Sierra Leone, building fragile new lives from the ashes of war. But for most, the revolution was unfinished, a promise postponed, deferred for generations to come. For women, too, the limits were sharp. They had kept farms alive, raised children alone, marched as camp followers, even fought in disguise. They had written, spoken, urged their husbands to remember the ladies. And yet when independence came, the laws remained unchanged. Women could not vote, could not hold office, remained bound by husband's authority. Abigail Adams's plea was dismissed as jest, her warning of rebellion unheard. The ideals of the Revolution inspired them, gave them language to demand rights, but the reality was silence. Still, their influence seeped quietly into the new republic. Mothers taught sons the values of liberty and virtue, giving rise to the idea of Republican motherhood. Writers like Mercy Otis Warren shaped the memory of the Revolution, recording both triumphs and hypocrisies. The Revolution's unfinished work for women would wait, like an ember, until it was fanned into flame in generations yet to come. For native nations, the Revolution was disaster. They had been promised protection by Britain, had fought and died to defend their homelands. But at Paris, their fate was sealed without a voice. Lands from the Appalachians to the Mississippi were handed to the United States, as though native peoples did not exist. Settlers poured westward, treaties were broken, wars erupted anew. For the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, independence for America meant dispossession for them. The Revolution ended for colonists, but for native nations, it opened a century of struggle, loss, and resistance. And even among white men, liberty was uneven. Property qualifications often barred the poor from voting. Debtors languished in prisons. Veterans, unpaid and forgotten, begged on the streets. In Massachusetts, farmers burdened by taxes and foreclosures rose in revolt in Shays' Rebellion in 1786. Imagine them marching with pitchforks and muskets, shouting that the liberty they had fought for was being stolen by wealthy creditors. The Revolution had promised equality, but class and power still ruled. Yet these contradictions do not erase the Revolution's achievement. They complicate it, give it texture. The ideals spoken in Philadelphia were larger than the men who wrote them. All men are created equal, rang hollow in 1783, but it lingered, demanding to be made true. Enslaved people seized it, women invoked it, the poor shouted it, future generations carried it forward. The Revolution was unfinished because its promises were too vast to be contained in its own time. Imagine sitting with a veteran by his hearth in the late 1780s. He stares into the fire, his musket above the mantel, his coat ragged. "We won," he says softly. But then his voice lowers. "And yet, did we? My neighbor is richer than ever, my brother fled to Canada as a loyalist, my wife still cannot own the land she tills, the slaves still labor in chains. Perhaps the war is over, but the fight." He lets the words trail off, the crackle of the fire finishing them. The unfinished revolution lived on in debates over the Constitution, in petitions by African Americans, in writings by women, in the cries of frontier settlers. It lived in the contradictions between ideals and reality. And it planted seeds that would not bloom for decades, even centuries. The Civil War, the suffrage movement, the long struggle for civil rights, all of them drew upon that original promise, that half-kept truth of equality. So as we step away from Paris, from the cheering crowds and ringing bells, we must not imagine the revolution as complete. It was victory, yes, but also incompleteness. It gave birth to a nation but left much of its people outside the birthright. It lit a torch of liberty but cast long shadows. And in those shadows, countless lives waited, endured, struggled, until the unfinished revolution became the work of generations. We have just lingered in the long silence after the war's end, in the unfinished revolution, where enslaved people still toiled in bondage, where women's voices were muted, where native lands were stripped away, and where poor farmers found themselves crushed by debt despite the promises of liberty. Victory had been real, but incomplete. Now, as the years lengthen, the revolution begins to slip into memory. And memory, as we know, is not truth, it is story, shaped and reshaped until it becomes legend. Let us walk now into that twilight of recollection, where the revolution became myth, and myth became legacy. This is Myths and Legacy. Picture an old veteran in 1825, 50 years after the first shots at Lexington. His hair is white now, his hands gnarled, but his eyes brighten as he sits by the fire, grandchildren clustered around his knees. They beg for stories. What was it like, grandfather? Did you stand on the green? Did you see Washington himself? He leans forward, voice lowering, weaving memory with pride. He tells of muskets flashing in the morning sun, of liberty rising in a single moment. He does not tell of hunger, of fear, of desertions, of civil war between neighbors. Over time, those shadows fade, and only the glow of glory remains. This is how myths are born. The Revolution quickly became more than history. It became a founding story. Its messiness, its brutality, its contradictions were slowly smoothed away in memory, polished into something cleaner, nobler, easier to recite. Washington became not the uncertain commander who lost more battles than he won, but the flawless father of his country. Valley Forge was remembered not as misery and starvation, but as a crucible of patriotism. Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, embroidered by poets, became a lone hero's dash, not the coordinated effort of many riders. The Revolution became a stage where the cast of heroes stood larger than life, their flaws dimmed, their deeds magnified. Why? Because a new nation needed a story. 13 fractious states, fragile in union, needed a common memory to bind them. So the Revolution was retold as epic, its figures as demigods, its cause as pure. The messy truth, that many had opposed independence, that liberty was partial, that war had been brutal, was left in the margins. Yet beneath the myth lay the deeper legacy. The Revolution gave the world a language of rights and freedom that could not easily be contained. All men are created equal. Simple words, penned by Jefferson, ignored by many at the time, but they lingered, demanding to be heard. Abolitionists seized them, suffragists invoked them, workers shouted them in strikes, civil rights leaders carried them into marches. The Revolution's greatest legacy was not its perfection, but its imperfection, the gap between promise and reality, which invited every generation to close it further. But myths have their dangers too. They can sanctify, excuse, obscure. The Revolution became a tale of unity, but in truth it was a civil war as much as a war for independence. Loyalists, hundreds of thousands, vanished from the story, remembered only as villains or forgotten entirely. Native peoples, devastated by the war's outcome, were erased from the triumphant narrative. Women, who carried the burden of survival, were relegated to footnotes. The Revolution, in myth, belonged to white men alone. Imagine walking into a 4th of July celebration in the early 19th century. Banners wave, orators thunder, children wave flags. The air smells of gunpowder from ceremonial cannon. Speeches praise the founders, the heroes, the miracle of independence. But there are no words for the enslaved who hear the cannons as chains rattle in their quarters. No words for the Cherokee or Shawnee forced westward. No words for the women who kept farms alive but still cannot cast a ballot. The myth celebrates, while the unfinished work remains. And yet, the legacy is not static. It evolves. By the mid-19th century, Frederick Douglass takes the Declaration's words and hurls them back at America in fiery speeches. What to the slave is the 4th of July? He asks, exposing the chasm between myth and reality. Women's rights activists gather at Seneca Falls in 1848, declaring their own independence in echoes of Jefferson's words. The Revolution's memory becomes both a shield for the powerful and a weapon for the oppressed. Globally, too, the Revolution's legacy spread. France watched and followed, its own revolution erupting in 1789 with cries of liberty and equality. In Haiti, enslaved people rose in rebellion, inspired in part by America's example, but carrying liberty to its logical conclusion, freedom for all. Across Latin America, revolutionaries invoked 1776 as proof that empires could be broken. The American Revolution became a seed carried on the winds, planting insurrections across the world. And still today, its myths endure. We see Washington crossing the Delaware, not with ragged men shivering in boats, but with resolve painted on canvas, heroic and unflinching. We recite the names of Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, as though they stood united, rather than quarreling bitterly over politics and power. We call it a war for independence, forgetting the civil wars inside it, the dispossessions that followed it. Memory simplifies. Myth comforts. But the legacy is more complicated, more alive. Imagine now that same veteran's grandchild, grown, standing in 1863 at Gettysburg, listening to Abraham Lincoln speak. A new birth of freedom, Lincoln says, invoking the Revolution's words, binding the Civil War to the same unfinished promise. Or picture a woman in 1917, standing before the Capitol, holding a banner. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Or a marcher in Selma, 1965, carrying a sign that declares, all men are created equal. The revolution lives on not only in memory, but in struggle renewed again and again. So what is its legacy? It is not perfection. It is not a flawless tale of liberty won once and for all. It is, instead, a foundation, a beginning that was messy, contradictory, unfinished, but undeniable. A story that can be told as myth, yes, but also as challenge. The revolution's true power lies in the gap between its words and its reality. In that gap, generation after generation has stepped forward, demanding the promise be fulfilled. And so, as our journey through this long night of history nears its close, we see the revolution not as an ending, but as a beginning. Its myths gave America unity. Its legacy gave the world hope. And its unfinished work gave every generation a task, to take the dream of liberty and carry it further,